Mrs. Walker, a frail and tired elderly black woman, sat in the crowded hospital waiting room, her grip tight around her worn purse. Every few seconds, she glanced at the clock, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting a sterile glow across the room. Her body ached from the weight of time. Hours had passed since she first entered, and she hadn't been seen by a doctor. The busy hospital buzzed with activity, but it felt like no one noticed her. Nurses and doctors hurried past, focused on their tasks, ignoring the faint moan of discomfort that slipped from her lips. Her hands trembled, and the pain in her chest made it difficult to sit still. She gritted her teeth, pushing through each wave of discomfort. But deep down, her hope of being seen soon was fading. Mrs. Walker's health was deteriorating fast. The aches that had bothered her for weeks now felt unbearable. Each breath was shallow, each movement slow and painful. Yet she couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. There was no one else she could turn to. This was her last chance. Her waiting was met with indifference. The longer she sat there, the more the reality set in. She was just another name on a list, another number in the waiting room. The hospital was busy, yes, but the lack of urgency in addressing her case seemed almost deliberate. Her body screamed for attention, but her mind stayed focused. She wouldn't leave. She would endure the pain. She had come this far, and no matter how long it took, she needed to be seen. The door to the waiting room opened with a soft whoosh, and in walked Elon Musk. He was a man of great wealth and influence, here not as a businessman but as part of a special initiative. His mission was simple: raise awareness for better healthcare accessibility in underserved communities. As he made his way into the bustling hospital, he shook hands with doctors and nurses, exchanged pleasantries, and smiled for cameras. But as his gaze wandered across the waiting room, it landed on Mrs. Walker. Her frail figure, the pain in her eyes, he couldn't help but notice her. She was a stark contrast to the energy in the room. Mrs. Walker was the kind of person who had endured so much in life. Yet here she was, waiting for help that seemed so far out of reach. Something about her captured his attention, and a knot formed in his stomach. Elon felt an immediate surge of unease. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it was clear Mrs. Walker was in distress. She wasn't just a patient, she was someone who needed help. And here she was, ignored by a system meant to serve her. Elon's eyes locked on the elderly woman for a moment, and then he made his way toward the front desk. He asked the nurse for more information about her, but the staff member only shrugged. "It's a busy day," she said dismissively. "She'll be seen when it's her turn." Elon's frown deepened as he watched Mrs. Walker clutch her chest, her breath becoming more shallow. The hospital staff continued their busy routines, oblivious to the suffering right in front of them. Tension built in the room. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Mrs. Walker's body swayed, her strength waning, yet she remained stubbornly in her seat. Elon, unable to ignore her any longer, asked a few more pointed questions. Again, he was brushed off. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable he became. Something was wrong, and this wasn't just about a single patient's wait. It was about a broken system that was failing her. Elon could feel the weight of the moment. Would he step in? Would anyone listen? Mrs. Walker had always been a fighter, a retired teacher with a lifetime of memories. She had spent years shaping young minds, instilling knowledge, discipline, and a love for learning. She was the kind of woman who believed in hard work and sacrifice, someone who had always put others first. She raised her children on her own after her husband passed away early, teaching them the values of independence, resilience, and kindness. She was the cornerstone of her community, a trusted friend, a wise advisor, and a steady presence in a neighborhood that had seen more than its share of hardship. Her home was always open to those in need, whether it was a meal for someone who had fallen on hard times or a place to stay for a young mother struggling to make ends meet. Mrs. Walker had seen it all, yet she faced each challenge with grace, dignity, and a never-wavering belief in the goodness of people. As the years passed and the physical toll of her laborious life began to show, Mrs. Walker's resilience did not falter. She held on to her pride as tightly as she held her memories. She had always told herself that she would be fine, that the aches and pains were just part of getting older. But deep down, she knew something was changing. As she sat in the hospital waiting room, her frailty was evident. Her body was no longer the strong vessel it had once been, but her mind was sharp, her spirit unbroken. Mrs. Walker was a survivor, and she had weathered many storms. But what she could not escape were the harsh realities of growing old in a society that often forgot about people like her. Struggles with healthcare. Over the years, Mrs. Walker had faced more than her share of challenges when it came to healthcare. The subtle prejudices that had once been easy to ignore became harder to ignore with each passing year. It wasn't just the poor treatment she received at the hands of some healthcare providers, but the indifference, the rushed consultations, and the look of surprise when she spoke up, asserting her needs. Her visits to the doctor had often felt like a battle. There were the dismissive glances from younger nurses, the questions that seemed designed to undermine her, the prescriptions handed out without any real explanation. She had learned to speak up, to demand answers, but each confrontation chipped away at her sense of dignity. The most difficult part was realizing that, despite everything she had worked for, there was an unspoken bias in the healthcare system, especially for elderly Black women like herself. She was no longer viewed as a vital part of the community, but as an afterthought, a statistic. Her voice became one among many, easily lost in the cacophony of patients seeking care. At first, Mrs. Walker had been too proud to complain, telling herself that things would change, that there were others with it worse than her. She had always believed in endurance, in the idea that time would heal most wounds. But as she got older, the fractures in the system that had long been invisible to her began to feel too real to ignore. The lack of care, the delayed treatments, the side glances from younger doctors, everything became a stark reminder that her life, her health, no longer mattered as much as it once had. Her most recent experience had been the breaking point. The pain in her chest had intensified, and she knew something wasn't right, but no one seemed to take her seriously. When she tried to make an appointment with a new doctor, she was told that she wasn't eligible for an urgent consultation. The receptionist had even asked her if her symptoms were really that serious, in a tone that left no room for doubt that she wasn't a priority. Mrs. Walker had been forced to wait for days, with the threat of her health deteriorating. It wasn't just the medical staff that ignored her needs. It was the system as a whole. The same system that had once hailed her as a hardworking teacher, a community leader, had now failed her. The feeling of being invisible, of being an inconvenience to the very system that should have supported her, began to take its toll. Family impact. Mrs. Walker's children and grandchildren saw the changes in her. They noticed how she'd begun to slow down, how the sparkle in her eyes seemed to dim with each passing day. They had tried to get her to go to the doctor more regularly, to seek help when she needed it, but Mrs. Walker refused. She was too proud, too independent. Her son, Gregory, had once pleaded with her, "Mom, you don't have to do this alone. We're here for you." But Mrs. Walker, in her gentle but firm way, had replied, "I don't need anyone to take care of me. I'm not a burden." Her grandchildren felt the weight of her pride even more. They knew how hard she had worked, how much she had sacrificed, but they also knew how proud she was of her independence. They saw how she kept everything together, how she kept smiling even when she was struggling. They wanted to help, but Mrs. Walker wouldn't let them. The guilt weighed heavily on them. They could see the cracks forming, the signs that their grandmother wasn't as strong as she once was. But Mrs. Walker's pride kept her from accepting the help she needed, and her family respected her wishes, even as they worried. They watched her decline from a distance, helpless in the face of her determination to stay independent. It wasn't until the situation had grown so dire that they began to realize just how fragile her health had become. In that moment, as Mrs. Walker sat in the waiting room, surrounded by indifferent faces, it wasn't just her physical health that was suffering. It was the emotional toll of a lifetime of pride, independence, and feeling unseen. The pain in her chest was real, but the ache in her heart from years of being overlooked was even harder to bear. Would anyone hear her now? Would anyone care? Elon Musk stood in the hospital's busy waiting room, his mind focused on the purpose of his visit, a philanthropic initiative aimed at improving healthcare accessibility. However, as his eyes scanned the crowded room, his attention was drawn to one particular individual, Mrs. Walker. Her frail frame sat hunched over in a chair, her hands trembling as they clutched her purse. Despite the bustling activity around her, it was clear that she had been waiting for far too long. Elon watched as Mrs. Walker struggled to attract the attention of the busy nurses, her voice barely audible over the noise of other patients. Each time she tried to speak up, her words seemed to fade into the background of the chaotic hospital environment. The nurses, moving swiftly from one patient to another, gave her little more than a passing glance, dismissing her plea for help with a mere shake of the head. He observed her closely. Her exhaustion was written all over her face. She winced with each breath, her chest rising and falling with increasing difficulty. Elon's concern grew with each passing minute. Mrs. Walker was clearly in pain, but it seemed as though no one was willing to acknowledge it. Suddenly, as he watched her closely, he noticed something even more alarming. Her body seemed to give way, and her head dropped forward. Mrs. Walker had fainted. The sight of her collapsing into the chair sent a jolt of panic through Elon's chest. The nurse, still busy with another patient, glanced at Mrs. Walker for a brief moment before shrugging it off, as though it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The room seemed to slow as Elon took in the scene. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the extent of the failure he was witnessing. This was more than just a simple case of poor care. It was a symptom of a much deeper issue, an issue that no one in the hospital seemed to acknowledge. Mrs. Walker's life was in danger, and the system that was supposed to protect her was failing her in the most basic way. Elon's unease morphed into frustration as he watched the nurses' indifferent response. He stood there for a few moments, wondering if someone would step in, but when no one moved to help, he felt a surge of anger. Mrs. Walker was still slumped in her chair, her breath shallow and uneven. A deep sense of urgency began to settle in Elon's mind. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew. Mrs. Walker's condition seemed to worsen with every passing second. The pulse of frustration inside Elon's chest quickened as he watched the staff ignore her. Her frailty was unmistakable, yet the hospital staff continued to carry on, oblivious to her deteriorating state. The nurse, still caught up in her own tasks, made a dismissive comment to Mrs. Walker when she attempted to speak up again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're just too busy right now. You'll have to wait your turn," she said without so much as a glance at her. Elon couldn't stand it any longer. He walked up to the nurse, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, but this woman is in serious distress. She needs help right now." The nurse looked at him for a moment, clearly annoyed at being interrupted, but said nothing. She simply turned and continued her work, leaving Elon standing there, incredulous. Frustration and helplessness crept up on Elon. He had witnessed the healthcare system's flaws in many parts of the world, but something about this moment felt different. Mrs. Walker's pain was real, her struggle undeniable, and yet it was being ignored. The growing tension in the room was thickening, as though everyone else in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. The doctors continued with their rounds. The nurses remained detached, and Mrs. Walker's condition continued to deteriorate. Elon's frustration finally reached its peak. He could no longer sit idly by, watching as this woman's life hung in the balance. He took a deep breath and turned on his heel, walking briskly toward the hospital staff. His voice was firm, but this time it carried an edge of urgency. "I need to speak to a doctor now," Elon demanded, his tone unyielding. One of the nurses, who had overheard him, waved him off dismissively. "You'll have to wait in line like everyone else. We're very busy right now." Elon felt the blood rushing to his face. He had seen this kind of indifference before, at corporate meetings, in the halls of power. But this time, it wasn't some far-off, impersonal issue. This was a real person, a woman who had spent her life serving others, now abandoned and ignored by the very system meant to protect her. "This isn't just a line issue. This is a life and death issue," Elon insisted, his voice rising. "This woman needs immediate care." His words hung in the air, but the staff was unmoved. The nurse turned away without a word, dismissing him as though he were just another frustrated customer. Elon's frustration turned into resolve. This was no longer about convincing someone to care. This was about ensuring that Mrs. Walker got the help she so clearly needed. He pulled out his phone and immediately began dialing the hospital's administration. The first call went unanswered. The second was transferred to an automated system. He could feel the walls of bureaucracy closing in around him. It was as though he were fighting against a machine that had no empathy, no concern for human lives. His calls were either ignored or redirected, each time more infuriating than the last. The system was broken, and Elon could see it for what it was: an impersonal, bureaucratic nightmare that valued efficiency over empathy, procedure over people. As the minutes dragged on, Elon's frustration grew. Each attempt to get through to someone with the authority to act was met with more indifference. He paced back and forth in the hallway, his eyes occasionally flicking over to Mrs. Walker, who was still slumped in her chair, her breathing more shallow than before. The clock seemed to tick louder with every second that passed. Time was running out for Mrs. Walker, and Elon knew it. His frustration wasn't just about the lack of immediate care. It was about the systemic issues he had seen time and again in his own ventures. Inefficiency, a lack of accountability, and the systematic failure of institutions meant to serve the public. It was a broken system, and Mrs. Walker's suffering was a tragic symptom of that brokenness. Elon's mind raced. He could not let this continue. His philanthropic efforts had always been about more than just donating money or raising awareness. They were about creating tangible change. But the scale of the problem here seemed almost insurmountable. Would he be able to get through the red tape in time to save Mrs. Walker's life? Would his efforts to disrupt the system actually make a difference? The hospital, a place where lives were meant to be saved, had become a place where bureaucracy reigned supreme. And at that moment, Elon Musk was determined to be the disruptor. He would not let this story go untold, and he would not let Mrs. Walker become just another casualty of a broken system. As Elon Musk continued to push for action in the sterile corridors of the hospital, the weight of the situation began to sink in. What had started as an issue of healthcare accessibility had evolved into something much more profound. A matter of justice, equality, and human dignity. This wasn't just about fixing broken systems or improving inefficiency. This was about the rights of every person to receive care, to be treated with respect, and to be valued, regardless of their race, age, or social standing. Elon felt a gnawing frustration deep within him. Every phone call, every attempt to escalate the matter, was met with resistance. He could feel the bureaucratic walls closing in around him. But the more he pushed, the more he realized that it wasn't just about fixing the hospital's broken processes. It was about dismantling the very systems that allowed this indifference to flourish. Mrs. Walker wasn't just another patient. She was a symbol of so many who had been overlooked, discriminated against, and left to suffer in silence. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just a personal battle to save Mrs. Walker. This was a fight for the most basic human right: access to health care. A fight for equality, for dignity. In that moment, Elon understood that this was no longer just a struggle against a malfunctioning institution. It was a struggle against an entire system that had failed to see people like Mrs. Walker as deserving of respect. His eyes flicked back to the frail woman in the waiting room, still slumped in the chair, barely conscious. The hospital, the place where lives were supposed to be saved, had failed her. And now he was determined to fight, not just for Mrs. Walker's life, but for the countless others who had fallen victim to this same broken system. Building emotional connection. As the hours passed, Elon's sense of urgency and frustration only deepened. Yet amidst the whirlwind of bureaucracy, he found himself drawn back to Mrs. Walker. The hospital staff were still dragging their feet, and calls to higher-ups were being pushed to voicemail. But Elon felt something shift inside him. It was no longer just about fixing a problem. It was about connecting with a person, understanding her story, and feeling the weight of what she had endured. Elon knew that the fight wasn't just about demanding action from a broken system. It was about truly understanding the person behind the problem. He approached Mrs. Walker, her frail form still leaning in her chair, her eyes now half closed in exhaustion. Without the distraction of nurses or doctors rushing past, Elon sat down next to her in a quiet corner of the hospital. "Mrs. Walker," Elon began, his voice soft but sincere. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. I can't even imagine what you've been through, but I promise I'm going to make sure you get the care you need." Mrs. Walker's lips curled into a faint smile, her tired eyes still reflecting the strength that had defined her life. She paused before speaking, her voice frail but steady. "I've lived a long life, Mr. Musk," she said softly. "And I've seen a lot, more than anyone should have to. But I never let it break me. Even when I was told no over and over, when I was treated as if I didn't matter, I just kept going. Because that's what you do. You keep going, even when the world turns its back on you." Elon listened intently, moved by the quiet strength in her voice. Mrs. Walker continued, her words painting a vivid picture of her life. The years of teaching, the children she had raised, the countless others she had helped in her community. She spoke of the joy she had found in service and the quiet heartbreak of being overlooked, ignored, and dismissed, particularly when it came to her health. "I never wanted to be a burden to my children," she confessed, her voice cracking slightly. "But now I feel like I've waited too long for something that should have been easy. I've spent my whole life helping others, but when it was time for me to ask for help, I was left to suffer alone." Elon felt a lump form in his throat. Mrs. Walker's resilience, her ability to rise above years of injustice and still maintain her grace, was overwhelming. It wasn't just a healthcare issue. It was a matter of human dignity. It was about respect, about the simple truth that every person deserved to be treated with kindness and fairness. He realized then that this wasn't a temporary fight. This was a call to action for all those who had suffered under the weight of a system that prioritized efficiency over compassion. "Mrs. Walker," Elon said, his voice thick with emotion, "you deserve to be treated with respect, not just because you're in pain right now, but because of everything you've done in your life. No one should have to face this kind of neglect, especially after all you've done for others. I promise you, I will not let this go." Mrs. Walker smiled faintly, her eyes closing for a moment as if to gather strength. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. I didn't expect anyone to notice, but I'm grateful you did." Obstacles. Despite the growing emotional connection and Elon's increasing determination, the obstacles he faced in securing immediate care for Mrs. Walker remained formidable. The hospital's bureaucracy seemed insurmountable, each request for help falling into an abyss of red tape and indifference. Elon's calls to hospital administrators were either ignored or redirected to voicemail. When he did manage to speak with someone, the response was always the same: "We are very busy. We will get to her as soon as we can." As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Walker's condition continued to worsen. Her breathing was labored and her pulse weak. Elon's frustration was mounting. He had encountered bureaucracy before, but never like this. In every other arena, whether it was SpaceX or Tesla, he had been able to make things happen. But here, in the face of a human life hanging in the balance, he was powerless. Each time he pushed for action, the response was the same: more delays, more excuses. It was as though the hospital staff, despite their good intentions, were paralyzed by an entrenched system that didn't prioritize people like Mrs. Walker. The resistance was maddening. The situation reached a breaking point when Mrs. Walker's heart rate began to falter and the color drained from her face. Elon felt a surge of panic. Every minute, every second seemed to stretch into eternity. He paced the hospital floor, his mind racing with possible solutions. He had made calls to powerful figures, but even they were unable to break the deadlock. The hospital administration had become so entrenched in its ways that even Elon Musk, with all his resources, was struggling to navigate the bureaucracy. Mrs. Walker's pulse was growing weaker. The tension in the room was palpable, and the question lingered in Elon's mind. Would they get to her in time? Would the system that had failed so many others fail Mrs. Walker too? As the clock ticked down, Elon could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had promised to help, but the odds were not in his favor. Would he be able to tear down the walls of indifference in time to save Mrs. Walker's life? Or would the system's heartless machinery claim yet another victim? The stakes had never been higher. As the minutes turned into hours and every second felt like a lifetime, Elon Musk's frustration reached a boiling point. It was clear that the system was failing, and his attempts to navigate it had only met with indifference. But then, just as all hope seemed to be slipping away, Elon uncovered a shocking secret hidden in the hospital's dusty archives. A secret that would ignite the fire of justice within him. In a small, forgotten corner of the hospital's administration records, Elon found a series of reports detailing patterns of negligence, discrimination, and mistreatment towards elderly Black patients. There, in stark black and white, was the confirmation of what Mrs. Walker had experienced all her life. She was not an isolated case. The reports painted a damning picture of a systematic failure, a failure that had been going on for years, perhaps decades. The medical staff's indifference, the delayed care, the dismissive attitudes, it wasn't just incompetence. It was a systemic issue rooted in racial and ageist discrimination. Mrs. Walker wasn't just another patient who had slipped through the cracks. She was part of a much larger, much uglier pattern. As he sifted through the documents, Elon's anger mounted. How many others had been subjected to this kind of mistreatment? How many lives had been ruined because of this systemic bias? His mind raced as the weight of the discovery settled in. The situation wasn't just about a neglected patient in a hospital. It was about an entire community being systematically ignored and treated as if their lives didn't matter. The discovery hit him like a gut punch. This was no longer just about Mrs. Walker. It was about a fight for justice on a much broader scale. And Elon Musk was not the kind of person to stand by and let this injustice continue. The shocking decision. Fueled by a mixture of rage and determination, Elon made a decision that would forever change the course of the situation. He wasn't going to let the hospital's failures remain hidden in the shadows any longer. The world needed to know what was happening, and he wasn't going to sit idly by while more people suffered. With a fury that had previously been reserved for his business ventures, Elon made a bold move. He called in the media. He reached out to the press, demanding their attention. He sent photos, documents, and testimony from insiders, painting a stark picture of the hospital's discriminatory practices. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. The details of Mrs. Walker's neglect and the hospital's long-standing history of discrimination began to spread like wildfire. As the news hit social media, it didn't take long for the public to take notice. Social media platforms exploded with anger, outrage, and support for Mrs. Walker. Hashtags like #Justice, for Mrs. Walker, and #Healthcare for All began trending. People from all walks of life rallied around her, sharing their own stories of injustice in healthcare, of being ignored, marginalized, or dismissed simply because of their race or age. The public response was overwhelming. The support for Mrs. Walker was palpable, but the outrage was just as powerful. People began calling for an immediate investigation into the hospital's practices, demanding accountability for the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester for far too long. What had started as a single, quiet incident had now turned into a national movement, demanding that the healthcare system change. With the public now firmly behind him, Elon's push for justice gained unprecedented momentum. The pressure on the hospital was palpable, and within hours, the hospital administration had no choice but to act. They could no longer hide behind their bureaucracy and indifference. Mrs. Walker was finally given the medical attention she so desperately needed. Doctors rushed to her side, administering life-saving treatment and monitoring her vital signs as her body, weak from hours of neglect, began to fight back. But while the immediate crisis had been averted, the consequences of Elon's public exposure were just beginning to unfold. The media scrutiny was intense, and the hospital was forced to open its doors to a full investigation. The details of their long-standing patterns of discrimination were now out in the open, and they could no longer sweep the issue under the rug. The investigation would take time, but the damage was done. The hospital's reputation had been shattered, and the healthcare system was forced to reckon with its own deep-rooted issues. The battle for Mrs. Walker's life had led to something much larger, the beginning of a real conversation about healthcare inequality, about systemic racism, and about the urgent need for reform. For Elon, the immediate victory was clear. Mrs. Walker had been saved. But the true triumph was not just in securing her treatment. It was in the exposure of a broken system, the start of a much-needed dialogue, and the promise of change. Mrs. Walker's case had been the catalyst for something much bigger, and that was the victory Elon had fought for. Just when it seemed like the tide had finally turned in Mrs. Walker's favor, the hospital staff was faced with a terrifying moment. As the medical team worked quickly to stabilize her, there was a brief but terrifying moment where her health seemed to falter. Her heart rate dipped dangerously low and her breathing grew erratic. The medical team scrambled, their calm demeanor faltering as they fought to keep her stable. Elon, still hovering nearby, felt a rush of panic. The press had gathered outside, the world was watching, and yet here, in this moment of truth, it felt like they were on the verge of losing her. Was it too late? Had the system failed her for too long to save her now? The clock was ticking, and every second felt heavier than the last. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, the medical team managed to stabilize Mrs. Walker. Her breathing became less labored, and her vitals slowly started to improve. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, but the tension was far from over. Mrs. Walker had survived the immediate crisis, but the larger battle, for justice, for systemic change, was just beginning. After the chaos of the previous days, Mrs. Walker's recovery was slow but steady. The nurses, once indifferent, now treated her with a care that seemed to come from the heart. Her vital signs stabilized, her energy returned, and though her body began to heal, the emotional toll of the entire experience lingered. There were moments in the quiet of her hospital room when she would stare out the window, her hands clasped tightly together. The pain in her body had eased, but the sting of how she had been treated by the very system that was supposed to care for her remained raw. She was grateful for Elon's intervention, but the hurt of feeling invisible and disregarded just because of her age and the color of her skin stayed with her. It was a wound that couldn't be healed with a dose of medicine. Her family, her children, grandchildren, and dear friends visited her every day, their presence a steady source of comfort. They had feared for her life and watched as the world came together to support her. Now, they stood by her side, marveling at her resilience, while also understanding that the emotional scars left behind might take much longer to fade. As the days passed, Elon Musk found himself reflecting deeply on his role in Mrs. Walker's story. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much this experience had changed him. He wasn't just someone who had intervened in a single situation. What he had done, what Mrs. Walker had endured, had opened his eyes to something much larger, a system that was broken, a society that needed to be better. In his quiet moments, away from the cameras and the media, Elon considered the broader implications. He had fought to get Mrs. Walker treated because it was the right thing to do. But as the details of the hospital's discriminatory practices emerged, Elon understood that standing up for others wasn't just about fixing a broken healthcare system. It was about advocating for justice, equality, and dignity, no matter how much the system pushed back. This encounter had left a deep mark on him. He knew that this wasn't just another issue to tick off a list of philanthropic efforts. This was about fighting for the most basic rights of all people. The humanity of it, the shared connection with another person who had been treated as less than, would stay with him forever. The media coverage surrounding Mrs. Walker's case had ignited a fire of public outrage. Calls for accountability reverberated from all corners of the nation, and soon sweeping reforms began to take shape. The hospital, under intense scrutiny, was forced to reevaluate its practices, policies, and attitudes toward elderly Black patients. Elon's involvement in the case had shifted the narrative. What had initially seemed like a story of a single woman's suffering had become a conversation about systemic change. Public pressure was undeniable, and with it, the hospital introduced a set of reforms designed to combat the discrimination that had been embedded in their practices. New protocols were implemented to ensure that elderly Black patients received the care and respect they deserved. Training was provided to medical staff to address biases and improve empathy, and for the first time in a long while, patients felt they were being treated as human beings, not as statistics. But the ripple effect didn't end there. The focus on healthcare inequality expanded to other institutions, and new policies were introduced to make healthcare more accessible and just for marginalized communities. The story of Mrs. Walker had sparked a conversation that would change the landscape of healthcare forever. And though the road ahead was long, it was clear that Elon's involvement had been a catalyst for real change. Finally, the day arrived when Mrs. Walker was well enough to leave the hospital. The sight of her family waiting for her outside the hospital room brought a smile to her face. Her children, grandchildren, and close friends surrounded her with open arms, their relief palpable. They had feared they might lose her, but now she was feared they might lose her, but now she was walking out of the hospital under her own power, with a new hope in her heart. Mrs. Walker stood there for a moment, her cane in hand, looking up at the hospital's towering structure. There were no words to fully express what she was feeling. Gratitude, relief, and even a small spark of hope were within her, emotions that had been absent for far too long. The feeling of being forgotten, cast aside, was something she had lived with for years. But now, as she stood before her family, she knew that something had changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. Her family expressed their heartfelt thanks to Elon for his intervention. They knew that without his persistence, Mrs. Walker might not have made it through the ordeal. Elon had given them something priceless, more time with the woman they loved. But beyond that, Mrs. Walker felt something that she hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging and dignity. Though she remained cautious, skeptical of how long the reforms would last, a small seed of hope began to grow within her. For the first time in years, Mrs. Walker allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She was tired of being ignored, but now there was a glimmer of optimism that the world might finally be listening. As she walked out of the hospital with her family by her side, Mrs. Walker knew that the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, she was hopeful that real change was on the horizon. And in the end, that was enough to carry her forward. The story of Mrs. Walker and Elon Musk transcends the boundaries of a single incident. It becomes a testament to the power of one person's actions to ignite a larger movement. Elon's intervention, driven by his growing awareness and deep sense of justice, did not just save Mrs. Walker's life. It set in motion a transformation that would affect the lives of many others. Elon Musk's determination to expose the flaws in the healthcare system became a beacon of hope for marginalized communities, especially elderly Black patients who had suffered in silence for far too long. His refusal to back down in the face of bureaucracy and indifference sent a clear message: justice and equality are non-negotiable. The changes sparked by his intervention brought widespread reform, with hospitals across the country re-evaluating their practices. Through his example, Elon demonstrated that standing up for what's right can push even the most entrenched systems to re-evaluate their priorities and behaviors. The reforms that followed were a direct result of the public's outrage and the media's relentless coverage of the story. Mrs. Walker's case became a symbol of the many who had been neglected and mistreated, and the systemic change that followed was a reflection of society's collective commitment to ensuring dignity and fairness for all. Elon's actions may have seemed like a small step in the grand scheme of things, but they left an indelible mark on the healthcare landscape, one that would continue to affect generations to come. As the story closes, the message is clear: we all have the power to make a difference. Elon Musk's actions serve as a stark reminder that every individual, regardless of their age, race, or background, deserves to be treated with the dignity and respect that all humans are entitled to. We are reminded that standing up for what is right can often feel like an uphill battle, but the rewards, both personal and societal, are immense. The story calls on each of us to take a stand against injustice, whether in the healthcare system or in any other area where inequality thrives. It urges us to speak out, to act when we see suffering, and to never allow systems of power to perpetuate harm without challenge. Like Elon, we all have the ability to challenge the status quo and make a lasting impact. As we reflect on the powerful changes set in motion by a single act of defiance against an unjust system, we are left with the inspiring reminder that real change is possible, and it begins with each of us. Whether through a bold decision, a small act of kindness, or a willingness to fight for what's right, we all have the power to challenge injustice and make the world a better place for those who are too often overlooked. The story of Elon Musk and Mrs. Walker is not just about healthcare. It's about the collective power of empathy, courage, and the relentless pursuit of equality.